Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our first webinar in the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism's webinar series. Our next webinar will be taking place on March 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, focusing on the red pill. The Institute for Research on Male Supremacism was founded in 2019 to call attention to the growth of contemporary male supremacist and misogynist groups and violence, and works to inform other researchers and journalists and activists. So we're going to hear from Megan Kelly. She will be presenting on research from her digital ethnography, looking into incel communities, and then I'll make a few remarks on some recent work I've done looking at incel terrorism and try to leave plenty of time for a question and answer. So thank you all. When we get to the Q&A portion, you'll be able to send your questions via the chat function on Zoom, and we'll see them and answer them there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, my name is Megan Kelly. The topic I will be discussing today is on incels, also known as involuntary celibates, and their current online forums. For my master's thesis, I completed a 5-month digital ethnography of 2 online incel forums. This presentation is an overview of that research and my findings. The title of that paper and of this presentation is Don't Just Rope, Be a Hero. Violence, Gatekeeping, and Identity in Online Incel Forums. First, it's important to understand what exactly an incel is. Incel is a portmanteau for involuntary celibate. Essentially, the individuals who are members of the forums I studied blame women for their supposed involuntary celibacy. These are extremely misogynistic forums where incels feel entitled to women and their bodies, but also regularly advocate for violence against women for not wanting to have sexual contact with incels. The first academic work about involuntary celibates were published in the early 2000s by Denise Donnelly, Elizabeth Burgess, and others. At the time of their work, incels were not associated with violence and were not associated exclusively with heterosexual cis men. In fact, the term incel was first coined by a bisexual woman who created one of the early incel forums that spoke about the issue of involuntary celibacy. It was in May 2014, after Elliot Rodger murdered 6 people before killing himself, that the incel identity became more widely associated with misogyny and violence. Rodger, who is perhaps the most infamous incel, committed his killing spree after publishing a manifesto blaming women for his unhappiness and his, quote, lonely celibate life. While this was certainly not the first killing linked to misogyny, Rodger's attack brought to light proto-incel forums like PUA hate, also known as pickup artist hate, later known as slut hate, and led to the association of the incel identity with violence and misogyny. On the forums I observed, incels generally believe that looks determine the likelihood of all sexual success, that other factors like personality do not matter when seeking out or forming relationships. They believe that women choose sexual partners solely on physical characteristics of their mate. They believe that women seek out so-called chads, or men who embody what could be considered hegemonic masculinity. The conflict on this slide is originally from an incel forum and portrays archetypes of chad and incels. This belief that only looks matter is often referred to as the black pill on incel forums. The black pill is a fatalistic pill that, when accepted by an individual, is the belief that they will always be an incel because they believe their physical looks are genetically determined and that this in turn determines all opportunities for sexual interaction or intimacy. The pill terminology is a mutation of the red pill terminology, which was first inspired by the 1999 film The Matrix, where the main character Neo is given the choice to take the blue pill and remain living in ignorance, or the red pill red pill and begin to see the world for what it truly is. One of the core red pill beliefs among male supremacists is the belief that women only choose men based on physical characteristics, wealth, and social status. These are seen as changeable characteristics among most male supremacists who adhere to the red pill. Whereas most individuals that adhere to the black pill, that incels believe that they are genetically predetermined to be unhappy largely because of their looks. And this is considered unchangeable. Incels in their current iteration are important to understand as there is limited research on this identity, but it's important to understand this identity particularly as it connects to violence, as the identity has become more associated with several violent attacks in recent years. Several mass murderers in North America have identified as incels, Elliot Rodger among them, and have been users of incel or incel-adjacent forums. In manifestos, videos, and social media posts, they've identified their incel status as a primary motivation for carrying out their acts of violent extremism. Additionally, it's important to understand the incel identity in order to better understand male supremacism more broadly, as incels interact with other male supremacist identities online and are perhaps the most infamous male supremacist identity because of their association to mass violence. Forums have become the primary location for incels to meet, communicate, and spread their belief, which is why I decided to focus my research on 2 forums. And several of these forums have been shut down for explicitly promoting violence, especially violence against women. So though incels sometimes deny that they're actually linked to violence or claim that people like Elliot Rodger were not actually in any way representative of incels, on the forums they explicitly promote violence and have been shuttered as a result of breaking community standards on sites like Reddit for promoting violence. My main interest in studying these forums was just to understand how violence is expressed in these spaces and how it connects to the incel identity. This led me to my research question. How is identity constructed and maintained around violence promotions in online incel forums? To help me answer this question, and after completing primary observations of the forums, I formed 2 objectives. First, to understand the types of violence promoted, the motivation behind these types of promotions, and the way that violence is promoted on these forums. Second, to understand so-called gatekeeping measures that are employed on truecells.org and incels.is, the 2 forums that I studied. After conducting primary observations, I settled on 2 forums, incels.is, which is now known as incels.co, and truecells.org. Incels.is claims to be the largest incel forum and was formed right before Reddit shut down the r/incel subreddit for breaking community standards by promoting violence in November 2017. Truecells.org is no longer online. It was started in August 2018 and was offline by mid-December. I chose to study 2 forums because I wanted to see if there was consistency in ideology and promotions of violence across the forums. I was also interested in studying forums of varying membership sizes. Based on the membership requirements, TrueCells was a more restrictive forum, whereas, again, incels.is claims to be the biggest. Finally, I was also interested in potential infighting between forums. So looking at consistency and also if things like membership requirements cause infighting or gatekeeping itself between the 2 forums. I conducted 5 months of observations between August and December 2018 and made PDFs of all forum threads I observed and later coded so I could keep records and in case the posts were taken down or the forum was deplatformed. So I employed 2 theories and a concept to analyze the data collected from my observations. Wolfgang and Foucault's subculture of violence theory posits that a subculture's acceptance of violent values likely lead the subculture to be more permissive of violence. These values act as a mechanism of social control, given that they require members of the subculture to engage in violence for their own protection and survival. Tadgfell's and Turner's social identity theory posits in-group will discriminate against an out-group to enhance their self-image. Social identity is then a person's sense of who they are based on their membership in a group. This gives the in-group a sense of belonging by comparing themselves to others and vilifying the out-group, and then helps them to solidify their own identity. Additionally, I employed the concept of virtual gatekeeping as framed by Razali Nehan to understand gatekeeping measures in the forums. In traditional print media, gatekeepers are those who control what is published. In virtual gatekeeping, gatekeepers can control access to information, membership, and identity. They can be both moderators or administrators or members of an online space. We took a multi-site digital ethnographic approach, conducting observations between August and December 2018 on both forums. From my initial observations, I was able to create codes of common language and concepts around violence, gatekeeping, and identity in the forums, and for my 2 research objectives. During the second round of coding, I coded threads based around these frames. My gender identity was a limitation in this study, as membership of both forums is restricted to men, so I wasn't able to create an account, also considering personal safety. Additionally, many incel forums, including these, have private Discord server chats and private forums, but they require membership, additional screening, and often a certain number of so-called high-quality posts, which are often posts that promote violence. This limited my observations to forum threads that were publicly accessible. Through my observations, I found that there were 5 main types of violence promoted in these forums: rape, pedophilia, murder, suicide, and torture. Members promoted violence through their usernames and icons, which were often of mass murderers, misogynist killers, and serial killers that targeted women. Additionally, both forums had some form of memorialization for mass killers, with particular homage given to known incel killers or mass murderers who had targeted women, expressed hatred of women, or that members speculated could have been incel. In addition to having their images used as user icons or referenced in usernames, these memorializations of murderers happened in the Hall of Heroes section of the forums, or by referring to these men as saints. Often posting the Hall of Heroes entailed lengthy descriptions of these heroes, violent acts, and speculation on what may have motivated them to act. These so-called heroes or saints, with a history of violence against women, were particularly celebrated for this characteristic. The post on this slide is a Hall of Heroes entry celebrating Ted Bundy. Though members considered him too physically attractive to be an incel, he is still admired on incel forums specifically because his victims were women. Elliot Rodger is often referenced as ER on the forums and is also referred to as a saint. The ER reference is just one example of coded language that promotes violence, as members use ER to encourage others to commit attacks, as Rodgers did. Another frequently observed coded word is rope, which references suicide by hanging oneself. The quote used in the title of this presentation, "Don't just rope be a hero," means don't just kill yourself, commit mass murder like Elliot Rodger did. Additionally, violence is promoted by taking credit for violent attacks, mass shootings, and murders. During my observation period after terrorist attacks or mass shootings, members of the forums would often claim that they were likely incels and judge the shooter's physical appearance to determine whether or not they were actually incel. While many members celebrated these events and openly hoped that the shooter was, quote, ugly enough to be an incel, unquote, others would post that even if the shooter wasn't incel, the media would paint them as one, as incels are blamed for everything, and this again reinforced their belief that incels are treated unfairly in society and are the lowest of the low. Through my observations, I was able to determine a couple of possible motivations for violent promotions. Among them, revenge, carrying out or fulfilling a sense of justice, punishment, and control. Specifically, control of women's sexuality was among the most common motivators for promoting violence on these forums. Additionally, members appear to post violence to gain notice and maintain and validate their identity. For example, a member might publish a post celebrating Elliot Rodger so that they are recognized by other members as an incel. Or they might later argue that they are more suicidal than other members to further prove how miserable their life is and their true incel status. Members are in constant competition with each other to prove how miserable their lives are to gain the status of being the truest incel. Members attempt to check each other by saying that someone is only incel if they do or believe certain things that individuals might assign to the incel identity. They then attempt to back these beliefs up by linking the belief to the black pill or other core incel identity traits. Some ways that this appeared in the forum were threads such as the one on this slide, which asks, "At what age do you think you'll rope?" Meaning, at what age will you commit suicide? The way this question is phrased is not a question whether or not members will commit suicide, but when. If a member doesn't think they will commit suicide, their incel identity might be questioned. Another example of this identity gatekeeping was seen in posts promoting pedophilia. Members would argue that by the time a woman is 18, they have already ridden the cock carousel, meaning they have already had multiple sexual partners. Some members of these forums argue that to truly stop being an incel, they must have sex with a woman who is pure and virginal. If they sleep with a woman who has slept with other men, the incels are considered cucks or cuckolds, which incels look down upon. They believe that women who have slept with other men will inevitably leave them for men who have never been incels, making them cucks in truth. The solution they offer then is to sleep with girls under the age of 14, because this is the only true way to no longer be an incel, as they are more likely to be pure and they can more easily shape them so that they do not try to ride the cock carousel later, truly making them cucks. It is through these arguments that pedophilia is promoted, and when members do not agree with this view, their identity as an incel is questioned by other members. Therefore, members might also be motivated to participate positively in these types of posts as a means of further proving their incel identity. Additionally, I found that members tend to promote violence in one of two frames: society building promotions or society busting promotions. Members that believe the black pill believe that there is nothing that they can do to change their situation. So the option then remains to engage in violence either against themselves or society. While the violence against themselves takes the form of suicide promotions, the violence against society falls into society busting or building categories. Society busting promotions are promotions that advocate chaotic violence, such as mass murder, beta rebellion or beta uprising, or raping as many women as possible. Whereas the society building promotions are efforts and talks to legalize torture of women, rape and murder of women, and to do away with age of consent laws, essentially to legalize pedophilia. I found that one of the most basic gatekeeping measures is who has access to these forums. Women and gay men are not allowed to join the forums. Members are supposed to be incels, which incels.is defines as at least 6 months without sexual contact, and for true cells it means never having had sexual contact. Both forums require that members be straight men. In addition to membership, both forums had rules about what is allowed to be posted. In both forums, any blue pill content, which is content that is seen as contrary to the black pill, is not allowed and may result in a ban. An example of the blue pill is someone saying that personality also determines successful romantic interaction and not just physical characteristics. When rules are broken, moderators can ban members, but members also have some say in who is accepted in the community. They do this mainly by gatekeeping the incel identity and questioning the legitimacy of others. When members have their identity questioned, they have to prove themselves as truly incel and of deserving of being in the forum. They can prove their identity through violence promotions or by self-degradation. They attempt to demonstrate how ugly and unlikable they are as a way to prove their incel status, or promote violence as a way to solidify that status. Ethnicity, describing physical features, and lack of sexual contact or any contact an individual has had with a woman are common ways to make a case that they are most incel. Ascension, or sexual contact with a woman, often a virginal white woman, is held up as the ultimate goal for incels. However, some members question how incel or black-pilled other members are if they value ascension. Because the black pill says that there is no hope for incels and nothing you can do to change their status, expressing desires for ascension may be interpreted as a sign that members are not truly black-pilled and therefore not truly incel. During my observation period, there were several conversations about whether paying for sex still made individuals incels. Those for paying for sex claimed that they were most incel as they had fully accepted the black pill because they knew they wouldn't have sex any other way, whereas those against paying for sex accused them of not being truly incel nor truly ascending, as they were sleeping with women who were not pure. Violence is a norm in incel forums, as evidenced by the various promotions of violence. Members are encouraged to post or engage with violent content, and if they don't or don't do so adequately, they are question the use of violence, then their legitimacy is questioned and their identity is gatekept. Members gain status and admiration for violent content. For example, one member who had been previously married and had children was allowed to stay and post on the forum because of the quality of the content they posted, which was often advocating for the legalization of rape. These rewarding and punishing social controls determine the content that is posted. Gatekeeping of identity and content helps then to create an echo chamber by not allowing any content that contradicts the ideology. Social identity theory states that subordinate groups will internalize inferiority. This is widely present among incels as they claim that incels are subhuman and the lowest of the low. However, incels then try to make themselves positively distinct despite this inferiority by saying it is better to be an incel than a normie or a cuck. A cuck meaning someone whose partner cheats on them, which they claim is an inevitability with women. Incels create two outgroups for themselves, normies and cucks, and non-cells, or the non-cells being members of the forum whose legitimacy they question. Incels use gatekeeping to solidify their identity as a true incel against non-cells. They do this through personal narratives and using violence to distinguish themselves against less legitimate members. An example of this is the stance of many members that claim that members are not truly incel if they do not find underage girls attractive or aspire to have sex with them. According to social identity theory, in-group members can make themselves positively distinct in one of three ways: social mobility, or leaving the identity for a more superior group; 2, social creativity, or changing the value of characteristics to make their characteristics more positive compared to outgroups; and finally, social competition, comparing themselves to outgroups. It is difficult for individuals to leave inceldom, so social mobility is limited, but forum members compete with other incels by questioning their legitimacy and establishing others as non-cells, making them part of an outgroup to solidify their own identity as true cells. With normies and cucks, incels employ social creativity to reassign values so that they are more positively distinct. For example, they claim that to be an incel is better than being a normie or a cuck, because women are awful, and if you're an incel, at least you won't be cuckolded. This makes it even harder for incels to leave, and they create a logical loop in doing so. The alternative to being an incel is to ascend and become a normie. However, with the logical loop that incels create, remaining an incel is better than becoming a normie, as incels do not want to risk the possibility of being cuckolded, which they view as even worse than being an incel, and an inevitability of being a normie. By staying an incel, members then continually have to fight to prove and maintain their identity as an incel. They do this by promoting violence against others and against themselves. Incels construct identity around violence because it has become a norm in the forums. They are rewarded for promoting violence and punished by having their identity questioned if they don't. Identity is maintained around violence because members are competing with each other to prove they are the most legitimate by gatekeeping other members and vilifying normies. Because their ideology of the black pill is nihilistic in the current society, violence becomes the solution to change or disrupt society. Unfortunately, simply shutting down these forums would not be enough to stop this ideology from spreading or reproducing elsewhere. Incel forums and other male supremacist forums are a bit like a hydra, and when one head is cut off, or in this case, when one forum is shuttered, new ones appear and grow. Since my study, there are several new incel and incel-adjacent forums, each peddling similar hate, violence, and misogyny. Further research is necessary to better understand how these forums and their hate ideology continue to grow and spread across borders and across the internet.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Megan, for that fascinating presentation. I'm going to make a few brief remarks focused on incel terrorism. I want to invite everybody to begin to ask any questions that they have in the chat function while I'm speaking. My recent article for the International Center for Counterterrorism, The Hague, looks at male supremacist terrorism as a rising threat. While we're focused in this webinar on incel violence in particular, I do want to mention that violence is a significant element of many male supremacist ideologies, and that while incels have gained substantial attention around attacks, particularly since 2014, that doesn't mean that they're the only risk. Incels that have waged terrorist attacks have, in some cases, targeted symbolic targets, which I think is a really key element of understanding how the misogyny works in this case. In the same way that targeting a synagogue is clearly an anti-Semitic act, some of the choices incels have made about their targets are intended to be symbols of the kinds of young, attractive women that they view as unjustly depriving them of sexual access. We can think of one of the earliest attacks by a proto-incel, George Sodini, who targeted a fitness class of women. Elliot Rodger, whose manifesto is the most significant in explaining the kind of thinking and justifications used by incel terrorists, who points out that his choice of what he refers to as the hottest local sorority is particularly intended to go after those women who he viewed as depriving him, and explicitly to strike fear in the heart of all women because he can't kill them all. And so these are very clear motivations around terrorism. And then one of the more recent attacks in 2018 in Tallahassee, Florida, by Scott Bierley, targeted a yoga class. Again, the same kind of symbolism we might think about with the prior fitness class attack and the yoga studio. And the sorority. So I think that while much of the focus on male supremacist violence has come more around where it might associate with white supremacist violence, we see particularly in looking at incels that there is a motivation from misogyny itself to lead to significant acts of mass violence, in addition to other elements of what Megan touched upon in terms of promoting the legalization of rape and other forms of interpersonal and sexual violence that we might see in incel and other communities. And as the incel community has evolved over the past years, it has become increasingly radical in terms of some of the themes that Megan touched upon in terms of heightened gatekeeping, pedophilia, promotion of rape, etc., and ways in which those are certainly influenced by other forums such as the Red Pill that we'll be talking about in our next webinar, and pickup artists who may focus on things like legalization of rape and promote what amounts to sexual violence. I want to take a moment now to just mention that the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism relies to put on this webinar and other kinds of events on support from donations. And so you can see on the screen here, if you're looking in, the link to our Patreon page fundraiser, and there's also donations through our website.